He doesn't want to miss either one.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so I think we thought Sameach to all. It's a particularly unique holiday, if you will. It's not exactly a holiday as such, but the importance of Tu BiShevat, at least halachically speaking, is kind of peculiar in the Mishnah and the Gemara. There's a dispute between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel as to what we consider Rosh Hashanah La'ilanot. In other words, the beginning, the new year of the trees. What does it mean, new year for the trees? The trees aren't judged, as far as we know, based on their merits and demerits, their good decisions, their bad decisions. The concept of Rosh Hashanah La'ilanot is really one that pertains to Romot, Ma'asrot, and specifically to Shemitah. In other words, when do we consider in the spiritual fiscal year, what's the cutoff for things like Terumah and Ma'aser? So if you work in agriculture in Israel, and you happen to grow fruits or vegetables or herbs, spices of any kind, basically any agricultural product, you have a requirement, at least when the majority of the Jews in the world live in Israel, to give 10% to the Levim. The Levim give 10% over, a Levi gives 10% to a Kohen. And since they don't have access to land in Israel, they weren't given portions of land like the rest of the tribes, we support them with these gifts, with these entitlements, and they, at least 2 weeks a year, they're supposed to serve in Beit HaMikdash, in the temples. So, biblically speaking, we're only obligated to give these tithes, these gifts that total maybe 11, maybe 11.5%, from 3 different kinds of agricultural products. That would be grains, anything that makes chametz, and therefore is kosher for matzah. So wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. The 5 are identified by the Mishnah. So basically the pasuk is Ma'asar deganecha tiroshecha v'yitzharecha u'v'chorot beqaracha v'tzomecha. So what do we have to give terumah and ma'aser? Only from the grains, the 5 grains. So if I have a field in which I grow any one of these grains, that's dagan. Tirosh in Hebrew refers to anything that's produced from vines, any fruit of the vine. So you normally would give from grapes. If you happen to forget, you can give from raisins. If you happen to make them into wine, couldn't help yourself, you're from Italy, so no problem. Just give 10% of the wine to the Levi. He should give on to the Kohen, etc. It's never too late to repent. And then rabbinically, so we shouldn't confuse these different species. We basically give Terumah Ma'aser from anything that grows anywhere. So, biblically speaking, I have no obligation to give Terumah from apples. The fact that we grow apples from trees doesn't mean that, biblically speaking, I'm obligated to give any of them to anyone. I do have a biblical obligation as it pertains to fruits, which is to eat the first fruits in Yerushalayim, or to convert them into liquid, to convert them into cash, and then take that cash and go to Yerushalayim, and then eat anything that makes me happy. I can eat meat, I can drink beer, I can, any combination of any fruits or vegetables that I enjoy. The idea being the first fruits that grow on a tree should be enjoyed. This is called bikurim. The first fruits, bikur with a kaf, not with a poof. Bikur with a poof is visitation, or to spend time by someone. Bikur with a kaf, like bechor. Bechor, like the first fruits of any given fruit tree, you have an obligation to go eat in Yerushalayim. And if you can't preserve the fruit somehow, it can't be dried, or you can make out of it some kind of a jam or a jelly or preserves, then you would just take the equivalent of it, eat it wherever you want, and then that money you can then go ahead and take to Yerushalayim and eat, once you do get there, probably one of the 3 pilgrimages. So Shavuot, Sukkot, or Pesach. When it comes to Tu BiShevat in particular, this is the cutoff, and the machloket is, the dispute is whether the first day of the month of Shevat or the 15th day of the month of Shevat. We hold like Beit Hillel. They hold that the 15th day of Shevat is the day at which there's this cutoff, where any fruits that began to grow, even if they aren't mature, they began to grow by the 15th of Shevat. I'm thinking of Shidduchim, phone call today. So a girl came from out of town and she wants me to. So any fruits that began to grow, in other words, the tree flowers. The flower is pollinated somehow, either on its own or by another species, another tree of the same species. and then the flower basically withers, and then the fruit starts to grow, usually from some kind of a bulb. So any growth of fruit that began before Tu BiShevat, the 15th of Shevat, is counted for the prior spiritual fiscal year. And anything that begins to grow afterwards is going to count from the following year. So why do we care? We care because I have an obligation to give 10% of whatever grew in this particular year by way of ma'asir. I can't give from what grew the following year for the previous year, or what grew the previous year for the following year. I have this obligation, and I have to kind of keep the accounts accurate. So since most trees only produce fruits at a particular time of year, this would be the cutoff for the ones that happen to produce fruits in the winter. This is effectively the middle of the winter, not just in Israel, but all over the entire northern hemisphere. So this would be the cutoff. So what's so super exciting or holiday-like about the end of the year? I don't think anybody celebrates December 31st as, I get to close the book of my taxes, starts next year. Maybe Ben does. I should take that back. Right? I think everyone who works outside of accounting isn't super excited. If anything, you're celebrating maybe January 1st, St. Sylvester, however they call it. But what it is about the end of the fiscal year that would make us excited is a little bit of a question. Why in Tu BiShevat is there anything even associated with Simcha? The point is illustrated by the fact that historically there's no mention of not reciting confessions, by the way, on Tu BiShevat. Today we tend not to do it. I don't know how stubborn the Italians are with minhagim, but you don't remember if they skip the vidur?
I think they don't do.
You're from Italy?
Yes.
Where in Italy?
Torino.
Torino? I was just
I think
studying
they
abroad
don't.
in Siena.
Again, they don't do the Tachanun, but I'm not sure.
So I can tell you that it's very recent that we don't do it. I think the Rama is the first one who mentioned, not mentioned the Shulchan Aruch anyway. So Rabbi Yosef Karo lived and passed away without commenting on it. It can't be older than 450 years that the custom became, at least in the Sephardi communities, probably in a few centuries after that.
Don't say it.
The Ashkenazim, the Rama is the one who mentions this in the name of prior commentaries, but apparently 400 or 500 years ago it became somewhat fashionable. I guess it became more popular. By the Sephardim even later.
I'll ask him that.
Well, I'd be interested to know. And not with influences. What the Torino was.
The minhag, thank you.
Yeah, I'd be interested in knowing what the original minhag was. At any rate, so again, it's not a day that's so easily identifiable as a happy, joyous occasion that there's celebrations. What exactly are we celebrating? The fact that there's a cutoff between the fruits from the previous year and the following year. So, interestingly enough, we do find comments in the Gemara to the effect of, just like Rosh Hashanah, where we are judged ourselves for what we did, for better or for worse, and how the following year is going to be, is at this particular point in the year that there's a certain degree of din, of judgment, regarding how productive the year is going to be. Well, this is right now, again, the middle of the rainy season in Israel. Actually, it's already a little bit towards the end.
Snowy season.
Right, snowy season here in New York.
And in Jerusalem.
I've showed me a cute post I would put on Facebook about all these songs, Hashkedia Porachat Hashem,
Right.
and a picture of New York. Everything is frozen, and it's like, just
Yerushalayim too.
yeah,
Yerushalayim has a lot of shelling.
yeah, Hormone also pretty much every year. So, at any rate, this is the middle of the rainy season.
Mm-hmm.
So, how much rain comes down is going to determine, at least in Israel, where it doesn't rain at all over the summer, how fruitful and productive the agriculture is going to be for the following year. So, there's a certain degree of judgment. We're judged on the rains themselves on Chag Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret very specifically. We have prayers specifically for the rains, requesting they should come in the right quantity and at the right times. And then this would be the time of year where our concerns begin to turn a little bit more towards the productivity of the fruit-bearing trees, some of the vegetables, etc. A couple of quick halachot that I did want to go over before I guess we'll take a break in a little bit to make some brachot. So two. Number one is that this is also of crucial importance regarding the Shemitah. This year is a sabbatical year in Israel, the Shemitah. We are not permitted to eat from the Shemitah fruits unless under certain conditions. It's a very interesting situation. Basically, biblically, when the majority of Jews are living in Israel, we are allowed to water the plants. We can tend to them in a kind of basic way. We're just not allowed to fertilize them or intentionally increase the output. We can deal with parasites. We can kill the insects that bother them, but not not prune them or trim them in such a way that encourages more growth. So the fruits that are growing until Tu BiShevat, in this case, Bet Hillel is lenient. They give you an extra 2 weeks for your fruits to be considered from the previous year. So this year's etrogim, for example, weren't problematic. Why are the etrogim not problematic? Because they had begun to grow before Tu BiShevat. They were harvested shortly after what's technically the beginning of the Shemitah, right? From Rosh Hashanah, it's the beginning of the Shemitah year. Almost all the etrogim in the world come from Israel, most of them anyway. The vast majority of them. So, what's the status of an etrog? Some from Southern Italy. Yeah. Well, there's a whole discussion. Chabad happens to, because it's mentioned in the Midrash. There's a Midrash that mentions they used to get these beautiful etrogim from Calabria. That's actually a period in the Midrash. And then they since then Chabad holds from this Midrash that the etrog industry hasn't developed at all since then. It stayed just the way it was in Calabria. So, at any rate, the etrogim, even though technically it was already the beginning of the Shemitah year, this year's etrogim grew maybe 2 weeks, maybe not even, into the Shemitah, so they weren't considered part of the Shemitah cycle. It's next year's etrogim that are going to be a problem. Why is it going to be a problem? For a number of reasons. Number one is because it depends, first of all, how you hold about the Shemitah and how you navigate the halachot. So technically, I'm a Jew, I live in Israel, I own land. If I want to grow fruits or vegetables, like I said, I can do this in a basic way. And these fruits or vegetables have the status of Kedushat Shvi'it. In other words, they have a status that's more special than the fruits or vegetables that are grown during the other 6 years in the cycle. And one of the unique features of these fruits and vegetables is that we're not allowed to take them outside of Israel. It's considered a desecration of sorts. So for me to take fruits that grew in Israel, outside of Israel, even though they were grown during the Shemitah, this becomes a halachic problem. So this is if I grew them as a Jew observing halacha in Israel. There are Jews that don't observe halacha yet in Israel. It's a whole other story. We call them members of Knesset. It's the other, perhaps more popular way of navigating or circumnavigating the halachot of the Shvi'it, of Shemitah, is by selling the land to a non-Jew, at least on paper, for this year. So if the land is no longer belongs to a Jew, then these laws don't apply to the non-Jews. And so if an Arab happens to be growing etrogim, there's no status of kedusha. There's no holiness associated with them. Therefore, I would be within my rights to export them, or to import them into the United States or elsewhere. Even if it was grown during the Shemitah.
The land of Israel, but then if it's
in the land of Israel, but under the control of the dominion or auspices of a non-Jewish farmer, which is interesting. Non-Jews counterbalance the kedusha, the holiness associated with the land of Israel. But that's basically one other way around the problem. So for the purpose of Sukkot next year, we'll have to be aware of the fact that the etrogim that we get would either be grown outside of Israel, say for example in Calabria, or they would be grown through what they call a heter mechira, this sale of land to a non-Jew, in order that the Jews can continue working on it, because technically it's not their land. It's land that's under the ownership of a non-Jew.
If it's the land of a Jew outside of Israel,
the ownership of a Jew outside of Israel, there's no Shemitah. No problem. There's no holiness associated with upstate New York or
outside of Israel. It's not important land.
It all has the same.
but they're allowed to cultivate it as well, or
etrogim?
no, to cultivate anything.
Yeah. There's no interdiction.
There's no question about.
Shabbat applies in terms of time. Shemitah only applies in Israel. In fact, we learn that from Psukim that say explicitly, Ha'aretz, the land that Hashem gave us. These are laws that apply only to this land. That's very serious, by the way, because the Shemitah appears in Parashat Behar, and the very next parasha is Parashat Bechukotai. The last two parashot in Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, and there are at least 3 mentions of violation of Shemitah being the cause of the punishments that are listed in Bechukotai. So you would think that there are things that are more central or more crucial to Jewish faith in Israel or Jewish society in Israel, but we're warned very, very severely about the importance of the Shvi'it, of the Shemitah, that punishments happen as tirtzeha haaretz et shabatoteha. Like then the land should, live through its Shabbatot without you working it. Like we'll be exiled from it because we worked the land on the Shavuot. And the punishment is that we should be exiled and not have to work it. And then the land should know its Shabbat. The Shemitah is called the Shabbat of the land.
I'm not trying to just do something. You said so. If you send the land to a non-Jew in Israel, so there's no issue. You can work it. I mean, if the ownership is to a non-Jew, it's okay. Mm. But he asked if you say no, just to be sure that if the land is owned by a Jew that lives outside of the.
No. He asked if a land.
I know if you live in I don't know. Let's say you're very wealthy and you have a garden with a townhouse in Manhattan.
Okay.
And you want to grow fruits in your garden.
No. My question is, what about like if I live in
doesn't live in Israel?
Yeah, I don't live in Israel, but
it's still under his.
Okay. So okay.
His auspices, so it's still.
So nothing to do with
the owner.
No.
Doesn't depend. Yeah. Okay. Wherever he is.
And so, last question: what define Israel? What if I want to cultivate land in Eilat or in South Lebanon?
So Emanuele, here's polemical.
The boundaries.
So there's a discussion. There's a discussion as to what's considered what are the boundaries of biblical Israel. We mentioned this before. There are actually 4 different delineations given by the Torah. Avraham Avinu gets 2 promises and they're different, and Moshe gives 2 others and they're also a little bit different. Technically, in its greatest state, Israel is supposed to reach the Euphrates River in Iraq. They can keep it for now because there's nothing interesting going on over there. The land is very productive.
People being beheaded.
It just produces terrorists.
But can a Jew grow stuff in this part of Iraq?
Yeah. So the question becomes, what is the status of the land? We tend to hold that only the land that was dedicated as part of the holy state of Israel back in the day, in the first Aliyah, so to speak, the generations building up to the construction of the first Beit HaMikdash, only that dedication was valid not only for that particular generation, but for all generations to come. So this would basically mean that that's the status the land has forever. It doesn't matter any Jew living in any of these particular areas. There's a little bit of dispute over some of it. For example, the Golan Heights probably were annexed by David HaMelech, but not as part of that because he was already living in Israel for generations before that annexation. So he entered Syria. The Gemara seems to make it clear for economic purposes. It wasn't like they were necessarily enemies of the Jews. Rabbinically, they applied certain laws to Syria, so people shouldn't cheat or come to confuse them. But Syria never actually belonged to the original biblical dedication of the land of Israel. So Eilat seems by most opinions to be excluded. And there's a question regarding Gush Katif, how far west exactly it would count, because when they came, they hadn't defeated the Philistines, the Perishtim. And so how much of that land was never actually acquired, and what degree of sovereignty the Philistines maintained over which particular region around Gaza was basically the determining factor. So they didn't actually have sovereign control over the entire modern state of Israel.
So if I want to make money, I can buy some lands near Eilat, and if I manage to have anything grow in there, I can pretty much sell it during the Shemitah Year.
Right.
No problem.
You know that it's miraculous to get anything to grow in Eilat.
Yeah,
desert.
I know.
Right. I mean, it's like 100 degrees Celsius.
This is why I mentioned the if.
Right, in the shade, it's 100 degrees Celsius.
No, Eter Mechira, don't take it, so if you do like
yeah, you can sell whatever you want.
Sell electrogene from we can't sell electrogene from Egypt either. No.
Right, from
Mitzrayim.
From Egypt. So put it this way, I think it's pretty much universally acknowledged that there is a chunk of Gaza and much of this area around Eilat that wasn't part of the original dedication. We never dedicated the Sinai Peninsula, quite possibly because we didn't have control over it at the time, but some of these parts were then rededicated in the second Aliyah with Ezra and Nehemiah when they came back from the Babylonian exile. So Purim, the story of Purim, when they finished that was over, they went west. They had already started rebuilding Beit HaMikdash, but they had access apparently to even less land. And even what they dedicated, they couldn't dedicate it with the same status. So there's a bit of discussion about what exactly counts and what doesn't. But interesting points to note. 2 other quick notes about fruits. One of them regarding Sheikh Yana. So the Shechianu bracha doesn't itself apply on Rosh Hashanah, or for that matter, to Tu BiShevat. It has nothing to do with either one of them. We recite Shechianu on fruits that have a season and that you're consuming for the first time. In fact, it's an interesting discussion if we should be reciting Shechianu when we see the fruits for the first time, if this is what makes us happy, or if it's the actual consumption of the fruit.
I thought it was consumption.
Right. So, there's, by the way, the same discussion rages over clothing.
Oh.
If
Like for Rosh Hashanah?
yeah, if I'm buying a nice suit for my brother's wedding, is it when I actually make the acquisition that I should make the bracha, or should I wait until I first put it on? So we tend to hold leniently.
You put it on. I didn't think there was a discussion, but I guess there could be. Yeah.
Nothing goes down without a
Right,
discussion.
I know. I
That's
thought
like
that
the
was when
general
you put it
rule.
on. It's when you first time you wear it, and they say
Nothing
Tid Chadshi, and they make the bracha.
Right. So our tendency is to be lenient. In other words, to wait for the most tangible aspect. Where, according to all opinions, a bracha should be recited now or even beforehand.
But you could buy it, and you can return it.
Take it. Right. I guess.
If you don't wear it, you
But
can return
that's one of
it.
the arguments made,
Yeah.
in fact, is that we should really be trying the clothes on.
Right.
If you have to have
It
the
become
tailor,
yours.
just to, I had to go back
Yeah.
to my tailor because
That's what I would
he
say.
missed something. So you may in fact have to return it if you find out that it wasn't alright done, or have to get it fixed again. So when's it considered a finished article of clothing on which you can even make a bracha? It has to be they sell suits and fancy dresses. I mean, knowing that they need to be tailored, basically. So that's an issue. We only make the shechianu on a fruit or vegetable that has a growing season, a defined and limited growing season, and it's only when you eat something for the first time, that particular growing season, that you would make the bracha. I was asked a very good question today. She's not here, but Abigail Levy asked, what about things like blood oranges? So you have the typical standard regular orange, and then you have what's called blood orange, which is a slightly different color. It's a little bit smaller, or they have some kind of a mix. The general tendency is that any fruit or vegetable that's sold under a different name and has some kind of significantly differing characteristics would probably merit a separate bracha. I mean, to put it to you plainly, apples are technically roses. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but apples and pears are from the same family, and they all belong to the rose family. So there are roses that produce apples, there are roses that don't produce them. But just because they have some genetic similarity doesn't mean that we treat them all as the same species. So if it's sold under a different name, or if it has a different growing season to it, different color, different shape, whatever it is, as long as it's significant enough to justify such a thing. But most vegetables have either have short growing seasons, you can grow them all year long under the right conditions.
How about those fruits? And here in the US, apparently we are all fruits are always present. And
Because they can bring them either from
I mean,
New York or Washington
of
or
course,
California or
they have
Florida.
seasons, but actually you can find it every time you want. How
So
do
a
you-
fruit that's available all year long, you don't make shit.
Okay.
There is no. I'm not happier about the red apples that I have now.
No, of course.
And it would be with the red apples that I have next month.
I can't think of a particular fruit now, but here I don't know. I see that here. It seems to me that here I can find almost every fruit every time.
The country is huge, and we have lots
So-
of different
so for
products.
the- so-
Right.
Fruits that generally have a season, at home I would say, in Italy we say Triano because I can find it.
Because
But
you used
here,
to have it, right.
in here I see every time.
And here you see them all. Yeah, so the general rule is that if it's available just about all year long, you don't make it. Yeah. Because again, if you think about it, what's the shechianu for? The shechianu is a new season of plenty. Has begun
I'm
because
thinking of a fruit that I didn't see what, for example?
plums. You can't find plums all year long
Okay,
in America. Or well, cherries.
Cherries. Sometimes they have
Kind of. It depends maybe on the species. But
Yeah, but then
cherries
it's
and
the
apples are
quality.
cold weather fruits. They like the cold. So cherries, you usually can't find them all year long. They don't grow well in hot climates. They grow in a little bit of. They need a winter, basically. They're like me. They need a cold season, otherwise they go crazy. So if it's something that renews itself, even if the growing season, let's say, is 9-10 months of the year, but there are months that you can't find it. So this is like you renew the simcha. And then one other really quick note about checking fruits for insects. You may not be familiar with this,
Oh, it's just
but
lettuce.
there's
No?
right.
Not just lettuce?
So
Front table, right?
So there's a discussion. It's not so clear from the Gemara what exactly the requirement is. Clearly, it's forbidden to eat insects. No one picks them up on purpose and eats them. In some cultures, they do.
Well,
But
they're protein. It's actually
Not in our culture.
there are all kinds of proteins.
Yeah, exactly.
Some of them are considered more universally edible.
They said if you're out in the wilderness and there's nothing else to eat, and the insect is your only source of protein.
I have to give the French credit for resourcefulness. They eat snails. I thought would never have crossed my mind.
And frogs.
And frogs. Well, you get hungry sometimes. Frogs.
Wild.
So basically, when it comes to the insects, it's you find a lot of fatwas about this in Israel. I don't know if you ever seen, like, you follow the packaging and the kosher guidelines sometimes. So it used to be that you bought lettuce or cabbage or broccoli or cauliflower from wherever you purchased it from, and then you started to see these labels that said checked or pre-checked or grown hydroponically in such a way it should necessitate checking, and even that you have to check anyway. So how much does it actually help? So it's a very interesting discussion. We can maybe take it up after the break. I understand we have dinner is here, so I'll explain. It's a little bit involved. Clearly, according to all opinions, it's forbidden to eat insects of any kind. The question is only what extent or what length you have to go to check. Where you do not know that they're...
And the locusts.
Right, and locusts you can eat intentionally. That's something else. If you can identify them anyway.
I can.
You eat locusts?
Yeah.
Why
There are
locusts but
four-
not spiders?
There are 4 kinds of locusts that were permitted to eat.
It's like a grasshopper, right?
Why do you say
Same family.
Why do you say locusts, not spiders?
Why
Permitted to eat.
The Torah tells us there are 4
Doesn't mean
animals
you
in the locust category that
Doesn't mean you
insects
really
were allowed to eat. Huh?
permitted to eat doesn't mean you really eat them.
Right, it doesn't mean there's a mitzvah to eat them. Yes,
It's not a
that's-
mitzvah,
that's
right.
it. But in Morocco and in
C'est
Yemen,
très bon,
they
d'ailleurs,
eat
it's
them.
very good.
I heard in Israel there was David told me there was a restaurant where they actually served them.
Locusts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yeah,
The Yemenites have
Levi
few.
told me that.
I heard it's
Give him-
very-
give him
my
that
father told me
rice,
in Morocco
give him
they
that
were-
rice.
Right, there's nothing the
something-
Italians eat that would otherwise make you
My dad,
disgusted.
very good.
my dad told
Locusts
me
are like the worst thing you've ever
Yeah.
heard people eating.
Yes.
So the discussion about the locusts, there happens to be a discussion. So the Mishnah says that it has to have 2 pairs of wings, one of which covers most of the body, the other is more functional and actually they fly. They have to have 6 legs. 4 of them they use to walk, and 2 of them are bigger and they use to jump. And it tells you there are 4 species. There's the hargol, the arve, the solam, and the hagar. The 4 species that are.
Bless you.
So the Yemenite tradition on this, and apparently this is how they held in Morocco, was that these signs you can use them to identify the kosher locusts / grasshoppers, and once you know that the animal, this insect has the right wings and the right legs, you just take off the head and you can, you'll eat the rest of it. Either their blood is permissible for consumption. You can eat them with cheese, so you can do some kind of a frittata. I don't know. Anyway,
They sell in the store,
locust pizza.
no, locusts, ants. They have crickets,
Chocolate covered.
They have different type of crickets, and you can buy like, no, I saw,
I've heard
they sell
it's
it, they
done.
sell it in the
Crickets are
health food
locusts,
store, like you can buy like, no, it's actually looks kinda interesting. Because they have like
There are
different
cultures.
flavors, they have,
Right.
spicy,
Here in New York?
they have, yeah, here in New York, they have
Okay.
The New York Times published an article
Not
about
for
this.
Tu B'Shvat.
A couple of years ago, how there were places in the city that were trying to stretch some of the health department laws. But mealworms. There are a few different kinds of insects that they were trying to introduce because they're popularly eaten in other cultures, and it's just a new.
Oh my god, who knows what you're eating then?
Actually, when we did Jersey to Jerusalem tour, me and this one guy got food poisoning from the beef we ate. We only had like a little
You
cube.
put that in a bug.
No, but this guy says, I can't believe I got this sick, because he's eaten ants, spiders in Malaysia. He says, I ate rats in
That's
China.
disgusting.
That's,
So she was asking why they're not considered basari.
they're not considered.
Basari, you said you can eat.
Just like fish. Just like fish. They're not considered. Really, it's only mammalian meat that's considered bisari.
What?
According to halacha, technically even birds you could eat with milk or cheese.
Yeah, the chicken.
Rabbinically, we hold that you can't, but biblically you could. The Mishnah says explicitly that fish and locusts you can eat them with milk or with cheese. There's no issue. So the only machloket there is, do you need to have these creatures identified by name, or you just go by the signs? So the Yemenites and the Moroccans held, you just go by the signs and that's fine. You can anything that conforms to this shape, you can eat. And the Ashkenazim, it's not atypical of Ashkenazim to have lots of doubts and suspicions about things and just to be strict and exclude them. But in this case, they wanted to say that unless you can identify, aside from the fact that it has these signs, can you ascertain that this is also what the Torah calls Harbah or Hagav or Arba, if you have a tradition. If you don't have a tradition, you don't have a tradition. So the Moroccans stopped about a century ago. And the Ashkenazim
stop. I heard they were eating them much more recently.
Yeah, my dad told me he found they were eating them at this time.
Morocco.
No, Ohr HaChaim HaKadosh came out against it in his time and suggested that he thought that people were making a mistake. They weren't identifying.
So maybe they were making a mistake. I'm not telling you how strict they were. That's another story. But
yeah.
My dad told me he had some.
He told me it tastes like laman when you told me.
Tastes like?
The man.
Like man.
What?
Like man.
Locust?
Well, the man
Like manna.
Like manna.
Right, no, what I was told from
Yeah,
Teimanim,
that's what his father said.
the Rabbanim that I
My
studied,
dad actually had some.
the Teimanim said
How do
that they taste like what
I
they
had no
eat.
clue.
So if they eat sesame,
Fried
they taste like
locusts?
sesame
Yeah.
oil.
You can fry anything,
If
it'll
they
taste
eat
good.
corn, they taste like corn. If they
With salt.
funny
They
story,
look
I'll
like
tell you
there's
that
legs
Rav Shimon Haramati, the Teimani rabbi in Yerushalayim, in the old city. So he told me that in Yemen, when the locusts, there was an infestation, he said it was a big simcha for the Jews. He said it was a double simcha. The first simcha is they would eat all the harvest, all the produce of the Arabs. And the second simcha is that they would bring them to you. So you trap the locusts and you can as many as you can trap, you can eat. The goyim in many places are very hostile to Jews that had land and were trying to grow animals or fruits and vegetables. So he said that it was a curse for them and a blessing for us. So we'll take a quick break for.